Hi, I'm Priya Banik. Welcome to my channel of Priya Banik Photography. Today I'm going to teach you about, or rather give you a little bit of tips and techniques about exposure triangle. Most people having a DSLR camera don't really know how to use a manual mode. So here I am basically to give you a gist about how to go about with using your DSLR. First and foremost, please turn on your modes, which is there, a little dial which is there on your camera, to the manual. There is no point in using an automatic mode if you're using a DSLR camera. You might as well use a point and shoot automatic mode for that. So turn it on to the manual mode and let's get started off. Okay, so we're going to speak about exposure triangle. Now, what is exposure triangle? I mean, there's so much happening about DSLRs and about exposures and about exposure triangles and what goes into making a great photograph. Now, these are the most important components in your DSLR camera which can give you great results, including some of the best photographers in the world can give you the best results using these three components. Now, like the name says, exposure triangle, it's basically a triangle which has three components, which is ISO, aperture, and shutter speed. Okay, so let's start with one by one, going into starting from ISO. Basically, all of these have certain advantages and disadvantages. Basically, we call them as drawbacks, which can give you certain flaws in a picture. But at the same time, in certain categories of photography, those are used as a plus point. So let's start with ISO. What is ISO? ISO is a simple terminology that probably most of you know it. It's called International Standard of Organization. The meaning of it is it's the speed of the sensitivity of the image sensor. So you'd like to always have a clear picture when you're taking a photograph. Now, the disadvantage basically of using an automatic mode is it takes up everything automatically in your camera, which you don't really have a control of. So when you take anything automatically, the camera is going to give you great results when you actually see it on your screen. When I say screen, it's the LCD screen of your DSLR. But when you transfer it to your system or when you print it out as photographs, it may not give you great results. Of course, depends on what you're shooting. If you're shooting with bright daylight or if you're shooting with flashlights, it can still give you decent results, but it's not something that you want to take it as a professional use. So speaking about how do we go about this, now let's start. ISO that I said is the speed of the image sensor, right? So it has two types of it. Basically, it's got a lower ISO and a higher ISO. It's always best to go for a lower ISO if you want good results and good quality. They're basically numbered as 100, 200, 400, 800, 1600, 3200, so on and so forth. Now, all of these depend on the make and the brand and the model of the camera that you are using. There's no harm in your camera if you have certain numbers are not there on it and certain numbers are there. It's absolutely fine. But ideally, I would always suggest go for an 100 ISO, which can give you the best results. What happens when you go for a higher ISO is it gives you a completely grainy and a noisy picture. Again, like I said, it may not be visible when you shoot it, as soon as you shoot it and you view it on your DSLR on the LCD, or even when you view it in your viewfinder, you can't really make a lot of difference. But when you transfer it to your system and when you want to make prints, especially larger size prints, if you want to make, it makes a huge difference when your ISO is really high. Okay, so it's a simple logic that goes in here. The more number that increases, it increases the grains of your picture. You can see an example right now on the screen which shows you two images. This one which is a lower ISO image, which definitely gives you a lot of great, the image is absolutely crisp and clear. And there is another image which is a higher ISO, which is a little more grainy and noisy. where the clarity is completely down. So, but do we really use higher ISO? Is it really necessary? Then people might have that question in mind. Why do we have it if the quality is bad? Yes, we do use it because the advantage of using a higher ISO is it adds on a lot of light into your camera. It pumps in a lot of light. So especially when you're shooting events like, a dance show or, any kind of program where the light is completely down, like a fashion show or anything where it's indoor and the light is really down, then you do go for a higher ISO. Provided, let me specify, provided these pictures are not going to be blown up into larger print sizes. So you need to know what your category of shooting is. You need to know where are these pictures going to be used. And is it going to go as a large print, or is it going to go as a smaller print, or is it just for web usage, or is it just for social media? Just find out from who you're shooting for, what is the necessary for these necessity of these photographs. So it makes it a lot easier for you to conclude on how to go about with the shoot. So the next topic that we're going to speak about is shutter speed. Shutter speed is the speed of or the duration of the light that you want the camera to capture. So it allows as much as light as possible according to the duration that you set in your camera modes. So let's say these are, again, in shutter speed you have two types. You've got a slower shutter speed and you have a faster shutter speed. Both of them have their own advantages and disadvantages. So they give two different effects to the same kind of picture. Now generally shutter speed is considered as, a frozen effect gives you a better quality. That's basically a myth according to me. A lot of times I use slow shutter speed depending on what I'm shooting. But again, slow shutter speed is something, please do not experiment if you do not have a tripod, because it can cause a lot of shake in your camera, which means, the most common term used is the camera shake, which can give you a movement in your picture, which gives you a ghostly effect sometimes if the camera is moving completely. And unfortunately, none of us have such strong hands which can take the weight of the camera and keep it absolutely stable and steady. So which is why the tripod is the most common usage here. So we generally it's considered anything below 1/30. I would always use a tripod. But what is the effect that you get in a slower shutter speed is that you get a motion blur. When you want certain parts of the picture blurred out, then it's ideal to go for a slow shutter speed. Now let's say you're taking a picture of a waterfall, or you're taking a picture of any moving object. You want the blur to be visible, then you can go for a slow shutter speed. But let's say you don't want the movement to be visible. You want it to be a frozen effect. Let's take a car or a bike which is in super fast speed and you want to capture the movement in a frozen effect, then you go for a faster shutter speed. Now shutter speed is calculated in seconds, so it's 1 by so and so number of a second. So you have numbers like 1 by 1, 1 by 2, 1 by 4, or you even have like 1 by 200, 1 by 400, 1 by 800, so on and so forth. So you can choose which type of shutter speed do you want and shoot accordingly. Now again, over here, if you're using a flash, be it a studio strobe flash, or it could be an overhead flash, or even an internal built flash, it doesn't matter. Any flash, if you're trying to connect it with your camera, we have a sync speed limit that you cannot cross. Again, it depends on your camera that you're using and the brand of camera and the model of camera that you're using. In most cases, it's 1 by 200. Certain cameras, it's even 1 by 160. Some cameras also have the 1 by 250. So you can set your camera. You need to check your camera manual for that to see what is the flash synchronizing speed that is added on with your camera. So just make sure you don't increase the speed of your camera beyond this particular number. You can go below that, but try not to increase your shutter speed beyond that particular sync speed limit. The last topic that we're going to speak today is about aperture, which again is one of the most important components. Aperture is the amount of light that is allowed into the camera. Again, in aperture, we have two types of it. It's called as an open aperture and a closed aperture. Like you can see in the picture which is coming on the display right now, it's got, a lens which is open more and a lens which is closed. So, which means, like the name says, open aperture gives you more light and closed aperture gives you less light. But here the challenge is the numbers are the opposite. So open aperture, more light means it's a smaller frame number, and closed aperture with less light is a larger frame number. Okay, and aperture is calculated as f-stops. So we start with something like an f1.8, f2, f2.8, f4, f5.6, so on and so forth. You can actually have a look in this in your camera. You can see these numbering as you go and turn on the modes. You can turn on the dial. You can just see the numbers. What are the numbers that are there in your particular camera or lens? Now, what is the drawback of this? We spoke about the drawbacks of ISO. We spoke about the drawbacks of shutter speed. What is the drawback of an aperture? Now, I wouldn't call it a drawback. It's something I really like because it gives you great effects in a photograph. It's called as depth of field. Now, when you go for an open aperture gives you a lot of light. But in certain conditions, it can be a drawback, because depth of field is basically where only one part of the picture is in focus and everything else turns out to be completely out of focus. So if you're taking a group photograph with all your friends together, or let's say you're taking a picture of a room where you want the entire room to be in clarity, it's not possible if you keep it in an open aperture like f1.8 or f2 or f4. In such a situation, you need to increase or rather decrease your aperture to f8 or f16 or f22, which will give you full clarity of the entire frame that you're taking in, but it will reduce the amount of light. So if you have an extra source of light, or if you're shooting in bright daylight, sunlight, yes, you can go ahead with it. But if you're shooting in a darker area and you don't have sufficient light, you will be forced to open your aperture to a large extent. But doing so, again, like I said, it's depth of field. But depth of field is a very, very interesting category which is used on purpose sometimes. A lot of times when you have a lot of disturbance in the background, like when you're shooting a fashion shoot, or even if you're shooting like, macro, like tiny objects, or wildlife, or any of that, if you're shooting, or nature where you're shooting just flowers, or stuff like that, when you want to shoot, you want the highlight and importance to be only on the main subject or the object. You don't want the background being completely creating a lot of disturbances with a lot of colors and elements, and adding on can completely disturb your photograph. So to avoid that, you can go for an open aperture, which will give you a depth of field called as shallow depth of field, which means only one part of the frame is in focus and everything remains out of focus. This is a very beautiful type of depth of field. The other category is called the deep depth of field, is when you make your aperture to like f16 or f22. When do we use this? When the most common thing all of us do is take group photographs. You wouldn't like yourself being completely out of focus in a group photograph, yes or no? So definitely you need to go for a deep depth of field. Or even if you're taking pictures of landscapes, or if you're taking photographs of interiors, exteriors, buildings, architectural, you would ideally prefer to go for an aperture which is more closed. So here are the three that I initially spoke about. A combination of aperture, shutter speed and ISO put together is exposure triangle. And these are controlled by something called an exposure meter, which is there in your camera. It's an inbuilt light meter that is there in your camera called as TTL, which is through the lens. So you can control these and just make sure you get the right exposure when you're exposing a photograph. So it gives you best results, again, without a flash. When you use flashlights, then the category is completely different, especially when it comes to a light meter. So the next topic that I'm going to speak about for today is white balance. Now, white balance, what is white balance? It is basically balancing colors in your DSLR camera, because not always your camera gives you right amount of shades which has to go in for the right component. Sometimes when you see somebody wearing a red t-shirt, it may not give you the exact red when you shoot it. That could be because your balancing of your white is not sufficient in your camera, or the color is not sufficiently balanced. So your camera comes with a lot of options which it gives you in your white balance category. Like if you can just go to the screen right now and see, there is an option which says custom white balance or auto white balance. So you can click on auto white balance if you're still not sure how to go about with it initially until you learn what white balance is. But you can always experiment as you shoot. You can always experiment what are the different categories of white balance that are available there. For example, something called as incandescent. This tungsten, incandescent and tungsten is similar. It gives you a different kind of a color in your picture. Or a fluorescent, or if you're shooting daylight, you can go for a daylight white balance. If you're shooting in a shaded area, you can go for a shaded white balance. If you're shooting in a cloudy day, then you can go for a cloudy white balance. Or if you want to make your own manual setup, which is custom, then you can choose the custom white balance, and you can change your color temperature where there is an option called as K, which stands for Kelvin. So you can change it according to what you're shooting, and you can manually play around it to a large extent. Now each of this will give you a different color in your picture. So ideally the best way to learn is the same subject that you're shooting, try different white balances to see which color looks nice. But again, this is just an experimental shoot. If you're doing it for a client, you wouldn't have so much time to experiment and play around with your white balance. So you can see it on my screen right now. There is a picture of a lady in different types of white balance, and it gives different shades. And there's a picture of a baby again in different shades and different white balances. So it makes you understand what exactly, the type of white balance that you need to use. So Kelvin is something that you can play around with, like a 6,000 or a 2,000 or a 7,000, depending on what exactly you want to shoot. So thanks for being patient and watching my video. I hope it's helped you to a large extent, at least starting off working on your DSLR camera. I would love to hear from you. Please leave your review and your comments below. Thank you.